Hello, everybody. I am here with Weltgeist. How are you doing today?
Very happy to be here. Thank you. We're recording this on Good Friday, so all the world is silent now, remembering Jesus, basically.
Yes, and on Sunday we can commemorate the anniversary of Faust wanting to live again, which is the way I celebrate Easter.
Beautiful.
Uh, yeah. So what we're going to talk about today is art and the very different ways in which philosophers have conceived of art and the experience of art, the experience of beauty. What does beauty mean? And something I mentioned to you when we talked before recording is that I've noticed that there's sort of I wouldn't call it a disdain for aesthetics, but almost a dismissive attitude towards aesthetics. Like this is a purely subjective series of judgments. This doesn't really have the kind of bearing on our lives as politics or ethics. And I think, for one, I completely disagree with that, being an artist myself. But when we look to many of the great philosophers, the great names throughout history, they don't agree either. Their aesthetics is a central focus for so many of them. And that includes both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer.
Hmm.
And Schopenhauer, of course, being influenced very much by Kant and Plato, both of whom had their aesthetic theories. And in many ways, you could say the dispute between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, the ways that Nietzsche criticizes Schopenhauer on aesthetics, I think go right to the heart of the disagreements between the two men and their entire worldview. But I know you had some observations about that, so maybe I'll hand over the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, first of all, I think it's very interesting that Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, he already says that life has to be understood as an aesthetic phenomenon. So, he really puts aesthetics at the forefront of the basis of or a foundation of a worldview. So you said like it's the least important aspect of philosophy as a whole. So you have metaphysics, logic, epistemology, politics, maybe politicology, and aesthetics is always like the neglected one out of the bunch. But for Nietzsche, apparently, it's very important, and it shines through in all of his works. Shines through in the works of his mentor as well, Schopenhauer. I mean, one-time mentor. Of course, we know that he completely went against his former idol in many
Hmm.
ways. But what is very interesting to me is that Schopenhauer always claimed to be a Kantian and to build upon Kant's foundations, also in the domain of beauty, in the domain of aesthetics, where he basically agrees with Kant's definition of what is the beautiful. And Kant, I think, has a very peculiar definition of beauty. He calls it a thing that is pleasurable or excites pleasure without being interesting, which is a very typical Kantian way to look at things, where things only have value if they are very impersonal, tries to objectify everything as objectify in the meaning of not subjective. He tries to make everything as objective as possible. And even beauty, says Kant, should be viewed from this context of not being personal. The beautiful should be something objective, so objective, in fact, that it shouldn't even be a matter of personal interest to whoever is viewing or undergoing the aesthetic experience. And Schopenhauer agrees with that. And Schopenhauer, of course, has this whole metaphysical theory built upon Kantian foundations, as he himself puts it. And for
Yeah,
Schopenhauer, evidently, the beautiful is that which temporarily pulls us out of the torture of being creatures of will. So the beautiful is that which allows us to temporarily forget that we are human beings, basically, that we are flesh and blood, that we have urges, that we have needs, that the will is always being at work, pulling us in different directions and certain towards certain carnal pleasures, for example. And the beautiful, watching a beautiful painting, listening to a beautiful piece of music, allows us a temporary escape from that.
I believe that the language that Schopenhauer uses is to become a will-less subject of knowing. Is that
Hmm.
correct? And so it's very odd to me because both the Kantian view and the Schopenhauerian view are just one of the odd aspects of it that I think there is a grain of truth to, but it seems very intellectualized. view of art,
Mm.
treating the artistic production as a creation of the intellect. And I think one of the issues that philosophers have noticed about artistic creativity, going all the way back to Socratic philosophy, is that there's this element of passion or the irrational. It's why Socrates has his sort of distrust of art or the poets, the
Mhm.
rhapsodes.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, given that Schopenhauer believed that his philosophy was sort of like a took main influence from Schopenhauer, or sorry, from Kant and from Plato. I can definitely see the appeal of the Kantian view, but it seems like he is setting aside that aspect of art that deals with the passions, or what Socrates would say, where you're seized by a god or a muse. Like in the dialogue in Ion, where he's talking about how it's not some art or craft that you're doing as a rhapsode. You're simply you're serving as an instrument for one of the gods, right? And, we can kind of understand that in modern language as you're expressing an irrational passion, or some sort of drive within you, some sort of something within you that you felt you needed to express that might not necessarily be based on reason. And so it could be socially harmful. And that's Socrates' view. Whatever we think of Socrates' sort of political or ethical views, regardless of that, it seems like the Schopenhauer really focuses in on the aspect of, famously he said that the best style of art were still life paintings, right? The Dutch still life painters,
Yeah. Aside
where
from
they're
music.
right, yeah, or music. The music is like the highest, still the highest form of art,
Yeah,
right?
it
Because it's
stands
non
completely alone, he says. Yeah, it's really it's music and everything else, basically.
right. It's music's almost it's non-representational, so it's like in a
Exactly.
different sphere. But I don't know. Do you have any like thoughts on that? Of that the Schopenhauerian view seems to take the passion out of art in some way.
Yeah, it does. Because he tries desperately to cling to his Kantian master, so to speak. And the big thing about these philosophies of aesthetics is that they always view art from, like, art as a phenomenon, they view from the perspective of the spectator. Like every aesthetic theory is always from the vantage point of one who spectates art. Like what happens when we watch a painting or when we listen to music, or even what is beautiful. To think of what is beautiful, you're already put into the standpoint of the spectator, the consumer, even, so to speak. And I think that's where these problems arise because every artist, and this was even evident to the Greeks, like the whole idea of enthusiasm was literally that you were temporarily visited by a god, and inspiration is also etymologically related to being visited by a spirit or by God. And doing this artistic activity was something fundamentally irrational, but that's from the perspective of the artist. And when you look at the perspective of someone who looks at art, then we get into the trap, or if you can call it a trap or not, but then we get into the point of view where we have to intellectualize everything, as you said. That's the point where you need to come up with a theory to explain something. But from the point of view of the artist, who is doing something fundamentally irrational, in other words, doing something fundamentally unexplainable, there is this big gap between the both of them. I mean, is that clear?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I really what I'm wondering is how Schopenhauer didn't see that aspect of having studied Plato as he did. I don't know if there's actually a good answer to that because it kind of requires us to get into Schopenhauer's mind, right? Or like his
Yeah.
intentions. But it's almost like, hmm,
But
it's
Schopenhauer, he played the flute every evening, as is famously recorded by Nietzsche. So he at least had like an inkling of being an artist himself, but still he was not a composer, He played the flute, he played Rossini, Mozart, but he didn't really compose, I think, as far as we know. Nietzsche did compose, by the way. He saw himself as an artist, as a poet, as a composer. But Schopenhauer always stayed within his own lane, so to speak. He saw himself as a philosopher, maybe at one point in life as a scientist, but always as an observer and never really, maybe as an imitator, but never really as a creator. And I think he really got stuck into that perspective. of being the spectator, which is a very philosophical point of view, because philosophy is basically spectating and watching the world and trying to make inferences. And he never really
Right.
saw himself
Okay.
as an artist. He saw himself as an appreciator of art, and I think that's why he has this, yeah, glaring hole, I guess, in his philosophy. And Nietzsche pointed out, by the way, that Plato, and he sarcastically says, the divine Plato, as Schopenhauer calls him, that Plato contradicts Schopenhauer quite a lot when it comes to aesthetics.
Well, and Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche really wished that he could have been a musician, because
Oh,
he
yeah.
sent his compositions to von Bülow, and who said, "Well, your composition is even more horrible than you think it is," because Nietzsche had said some self-deprecating things like, "Oh, it's not that good," and he was, "Yeah,
Mhm.
you're wrong. It's actually worse than you think." And I've listened to Nietzsche's music. I actually enjoy quite a bit of it, but I have gotten that impression that he wished he could have been a musician, and maybe that artistic drive like finds its way into his philosophy. That he's sort of an artist trying to do philosophy, whereas when Schopenhauer is playing the flute, he's a philosopher playing the flute.
Oh, very true. That's a good observation. Yeah, because Nietzsche, you can see it also when it's kind of sad actually. So, for example, the joyful science, I always call it the joyful science, by the way. But in the joyful science, it's full of poetry and poems, and people like when you read introductions to these books, they say like, "Oh yeah, you can disregard the poems. They're not very good. They're not very special. They're not." But evidently, Nietzsche poured his heart and soul into these poems. He thought they were very valuable, very important, like a key to his philosophy. Zarathustra on its own, like the entire book is basically one big poem, you know?
Yeah.
So this was a very important aspect of his personality. Like as you said, I think he really did see himself as an artist first, a philosopher second, but he also had the self knowledge to realize that okay, I'll never be an artist of the first rank, so I'll resign myself, I guess, to philosophy.
Yeah, there's that famous quote where he says, "I've been the most musical philosopher ever to have written, although I must admit I have not been a very successful musician." And so it's almost like
Yeah.
it's a good level of self-awareness there.
That's also a dig at Schopenhauer, I believe, by the way. Like, obviously, we can't read his mind, but Schopenhauer was known, especially at the time, as the philosopher of music, you know? So
Mhm.
when Nietzsche says, I'm the most musical philosopher, he's basically saying, I'm doing a one up on you, you know?
Well, and I can understand that given that Schopenhauer does place music in a realm of its own, so to speak. But Schopenhauer's actual style of writing is not very musical, and that's kind of an aesthetic judgment, so it's a bit difficult to demonstrate it. But I would say some of his essays might have a bit of, they have a little bit more of a stylistic flow to them. But Schopenhauer's style, even in his more, when he's not writing with, as Nietzsche would call it, a logical corset, in his sort of more fragmentary essays, even then, Schopenhauer's style is very, he has that sort of, Schopenhauer's very funny, actually, in a lot of ways. But
Exactly.
it's in that very dry, like almost, I don't know, just cynical style of humor that is very understated. And I don't know if it doesn't necessarily feel musical to me. In many ways, he's kind of like Schopenhauer reminds me, from what I know of his style, outside of world and world representation, of kind of almost like I don't know what, like a sophisticated, cynical comedian in many ways. Like the guy who says, uh, "Oh yeah, here's how underneath all the apparently good things in life, let me show you the things I've observed about why it's not actually as great as all that." I remember one anecdote I think Kaufman cites in his book on Nietzsche. Schopenhauer was talking to, I don't remember who he was talking to, just a friend who was saying, "You really don't believe we're rewarded after death for our good deeds?" And Schopenhauer just sort of looked at him expressionless and said, "What, you think you should you should be tipped for not poisoning your dying mother or not stealing from your blood relatives and stuff?" So yeah, I don't know. It's like I get that kind of energy from most of Schopenhauer's writing.
There is a little known anecdote where Schopenhauer was kicked out of a. He was living in Italy for a while, and there was a certain cafe where lots of German writers and artists and basically German expats were gathering. And he was kicked out of that cafe because during a discussion on aesthetics, on art, Schopenhauer made the point that Greek art and the Greek worldview was very blessed to have the pantheon of the Olympic gods. So you have this entire group of people, very different, very recognizable. You have this wide cast of characters, the wise Athena, the drunk Dionysus, the dark Hades. This entire cast, which is a very good source material for artists to do all kinds of interesting things with. And one of these Germans replied that, yeah, sure, but we, in the Christian era, we have the 12 apostles of Jesus. And, and Schopenhauer replied something like, get out of my sight, you Philistine, with your 12 little apostles. And that's what got him kicked out of
Oh,
this
wow.
German cafe.
Well, yeah, I mean, but he's right. They're not really, I don't know. I'm sure I'll get flack for saying this, but they're not really distinct characters, the 12 apostles. Like
No,
there's
not unless you really get into theology. Like obviously you can recognize Poseidon by his trident. Everyone knows that. But like the
right.
apostles, yeah, like the artists, especially in the medieval era, they would always every apostle and every holy person, every saint has his own little artifact, his own little object that he carries with him. Like Saint Sebastian, for example, is very famous. He is always pierced with arrows.
Hmm.
Saint Bartholomew, one of the apostles, he was skinned alive according to tradition, so he's always depicted holding the skin of a human in his hands. So there is like there's artists looked for ways to individualize these apostles, make it not
Is
one big.
Bartholomew Bartholomew depicted as holding? Is he skinned while he's holding the human skin?
Well, so the legend goes that he died a martyr, obviously, and he was skinned alive when he refused to denounce Christ. And he was skinned alive, according to legends. And so artists took to no, they just paint a regular guy, but he
Okay,
will be
okay.
holding the skin of a human.
So it's sort of like Hercules wearing the Nemean lion's
Yeah, the lion pelt. Yeah,
skin
exactly.
while he's fighting the Nemean lion. Like if
Well,
he
he's
has his
holding it in his
skin,
hand. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right. If he's like
Yeah, so
wearing if he still has his own skin on, but he's also holding the skin in his hands. I
yeah,
guess,
yeah.
and
It becomes like this artifact by which you can recognize him. Yeah.
right.
A very famous depiction, by the way, in The Last Judgment by Da Vinci in the Sistine Chapel. That's where you see Bartholomew holding his own skin, basically. Yeah.
Oh, it's in the Sistine Chapel. So
Yeah.
I've been there, but there is so much to look at, and they're just trying to like rush you through. It feels like by the time you get there at the
Yeah, they
Vatican.
push you out really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, the rule. Quick digression here. The rule is no flash photography, obviously.
Hmm.
Um, and the one group that was violating that just brazenly was a group of nuns when I was there.
Wow.
Which it was just an image that I'll always remember of them being like, "Hey, no photography," and these nuns are like kind of sneakily pulling out their camera,
No,
like
but
kind of under the robes.
that's the beautiful Catholic tradition of sanctioned hypocrisy.
Right.
We'll go to confession and everything will be fine.
Yeah, that's true. Forgive me, Father, for I have perhaps damaged the integrity of the Sistine Chapel ever so slightly.
No, the
But
thing is, like another quick digression, but they actually ruined the painting, The Last Supper. At one point, they built a doorway, like so it's a fresco, so it's painted on the wall of a
right.
dining room of what used to be a nunnery, basically, and or a chapel rather, and they cut off the feet of Jesus to build the doorway, which is very blasphemous in its own way. But
Yeah, wow. I didn't realize that. That's the state of it today, the fresco?
yes, and it's amazingly well preserved. It's actually a slight miracle that it's as well preserved as it is, because in Napoleon's day, they used it as a stable for horses.
No. Wow.
Yeah, just complete disregard for the beauty of it.
Right. I wonder, I'm sure there are people out there who would say, well, that's because Napoleon was a, antichrist type figure. Yeah, well, so to go back to aesthetics, I guess, one of the things that's been on my mind about this, and maybe I could read just a brief excerpt from Twilight of the Idols. This is from Skirmishes of the Untimely Man, part
Sure.
8. called Concerning the Psychology of the Artist, and I'll just read a couple lines from it. Where Nietzsche says, "For art to be possible at all, that is to say, in order that an aesthetic mode of action and of observation may exist, a certain preliminary physiological state is indispensable ecstasy. This state of ecstasy must first have intensified the susceptibility of the whole machine, otherwise no art is possible." And then a little bit further down, he sort of describes, he talks about the ecstasy, which is the outcome of all great desires, all strong passions, the ecstasy of the feast, of the arena, of the act of bravery, of victory. He says the essential feature is the feeling of increased strength and abundance. Actuated by this feeling, a man gives of himself to things. He forces them to partake of his riches. He does violence to them. This process is called idealizing. And he says a little further, idealizing does not consist in a suppression of a detail or of unessential features. It's a stupendous accentuation. And so I was sort of going through looking at things Nietzsche said on art in preparation for this conversation. And I sort of read that passage with new eyes, thinking about it in relation to what Schopenhauer's view of art is, and the Kantian view for that matter. Because it seems like in their view, there's like a deadening of the passions that occurs, whereas Nietzsche sees this like Hellenic excess. And I don't know, I'm wondering what you would think about it, mainly the passage where he talks about overflowing in abundance, that there's this aspect of art of wanting to impress your own passions on others, or some sort of state or feeling that you've had, some sort of state of mind. It could even be an idea, I think, but maybe more of an emotional idea, if that makes sense, that Nietzsche sees as sort of transmitted by art here, or that you're forcing it on others, right?
Yeah,
When you watch my film, I'm going to force you to feel this thing. You know, you watch something like Taxi Driver, I'm going to force you to feel alienated and paranoid, like the main character is, right? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Which of the views of art do you think there's something to the Schopenhauerian view of art? Do you think there's something to the Nietzschean view? How do you work that out? Because I'm definitely more on the Nietzschean side of things, even though I can see the Schopenhauer, the grain of truth in that.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you brought your interpretation of those passages, because I would view them in a not a completely different way, but in a slightly different way. Because in the joyful science, I try to say the joyful science, by the way, because no one uses gay in that manner anymore, and it's like whatever.
The
But
only reason why the good argument I heard was when Professor Hans Georg Moeller was talking about it, and he said you could translate it as sort of like the frolicking science, not literally,
mhm.
but obviously fröhliche
Yeah,
Wissenschaft.
but
And,
frolicking, yeah, frolicking. This is a tangent, but frolicking is like etymologically related to the German fröhlich, but also to the Dutch vrolijk, which means joyful, basically. So
hmm,
that's why I always say joyful. I think it's the best. I'm speaking both German and Dutch. I think it's like the best English translation there is. In the joyful science, Nietzsche at one point admits that he's made a mistake. And the mistake consisted in his own words, his misunderstanding of romanticism and what romanticism meant and what romanticism is fundamentally. That's basically the entire point where he goes 180 against what he wrote in The Birth of Tragedy. So listeners may know that he wrote The Birth of Tragedy while under the spell, you could say, of Schopenhauer and Wagner. Later on in his philosophical career, he disavowed basically all of that, went completely 180 in the opposite direction, completely disavowed Schopenhauer, completely disavowed the late works of Wagner. But in a very interesting turn of events, he tried to save the reputation of The Birth of Tragedy, his first book. He gave it a new subtitle, he wrote a new introduction in which he tried to basically say, yeah, in this book, I may say some things that I don't agree with now, but actually, there was a secret meaning to the text all along, and this is basically the secret meaning of the text. And he explains it in his foreword, an attempt at self criticism, which is not a self criticism at all, by the way. It's a vindication of his earlier self. But the point is, he completely, and that's his mistake that he talks about in Joyful Science, he completely misunderstood the meaning of tragedy for the Greeks. And so, by extension, the meaning of art for humanity. And the oldest argument for why tragedy was such why it was invented by the Greeks in the first place. And this is from Aristotle, this is from Plato, Schopenhauer. But tragedy, which is a very pessimistic art form, the traditional reading goes that tragedy arose out of a catharsis. So that's Aristotle. We're confronted with the suffering of the world through the stage, and in being fellow sufferers to what happens on the stage, we get like a temporary relief from our own suffering. Like my life might be quite horrible, quite bad, but at least it's not as bad as Oedipus, who has to pluck out his own eyes for, being in love with his mom and that kind of stuff. So it gives us a temporary relief. And the question for Nietzsche has always been, why would these Greeks, which by all accounts are a people that are full of joy for life on the one hand, but a very deep pessimism on the other, his big question has always been, why did the Greeks of all people invent tragedy? And that's what the birth of tragedy, of course, is all about. But he subscribed to this Schopenhauerian view that in getting subsumed into the tragedy on stage, you temporarily forget your own suffering. And that's the catharsis effect. But later on in his intellectual career, Nietzsche goes against that. And that's where it gets interesting and also very difficult for me personally, because for the longest time, I didn't quite understand what Nietzsche meant by this. But he basically says that the Greeks were so overflowing with a joy for life and so overflowing with vitality and a desire to act, not just to think, a desire to be in the world, a desire for life. They were so overflowing with that kind of energy that the pessimistic tragedy, where everything goes wrong and everything is horrible and everything is depressing and pessimistic, that it's almost a luxury, something that you can afford, coming from the overabundance of life, a thankfulness from the artist for life, where the tragedy is like a luxury where you permit yourself to feel bad for a little bit. So,
Right.
like a very vulgar analogy would be, for example, if you're a guy who's deep into fitness, you always watch your diet, you're always on point, you're always in the gym, you're always tracking your macros, always watching what you eat. But every once in a while, because you're so diligent other times, like every Sunday, you'll just eat some McDonald's, You know it's bad for you, but because you've been the opposite of a McDonald's enjoyer, I guess, in all other times, that's when you allow yourself the luxury of, okay, I can eat some McDonald's slop. And he saw tragedy for Greeks in the same way. These people were so full of a joy for life that they allowed themselves the luxury of tragedy, which is for me, it was a very, and it still is a very difficult point of view to empathize with, like to understand for myself.
Yeah, hmm. I think that view somewhat works though with because the ecstatic overflow that he's talking about in Twilight of Idols, forcing someone else to enjoy your riches, so to speak. I think it works with that view of tragedy as a luxury. If that experience is enjoyable, right? In the same way the luxurious enjoyment of McDonald's once a week is still enjoyable, even though you know it's bad for you, right? Even if it doesn't come from a catharsis, the Aristotelian view that you're sort of like purging, melancholy feelings from yourself by enjoying the dramatic tragedy on the stage.
Yeah, like the 2 minutes of hate in Orwell. That's like
Yeah,
probably a more recognizable point of view for listeners. Like the two
yeah,
minutes of
for
hate, where you
catharsis.
take all your trouble with the regime, you take it all out in those 2 minutes, and of course, your 2 minutes are part of the bigger regime. Like it's
Right.
like a false little escape or like a pressure valve. Pressure goes off, and then okay, great, now time to turn it back on again. But at least you got your little escape for a while.
Right. The safety valve analogy for catharsis, I think, is a really
Yeah, yeah, exactly,
helpful
exactly.
one. Yeah. It sort of builds up and then you have to release it. Versus the Nietzschean view that it's like a neurosis of the healthy. That
Yeah,
I'm so healthy that I can enjoy
yeah, exactly.
this
Yeah.
completely life denying. But I think even that. So could that not be a feeling of ecstasy in itself, though? It comes from the Dionysian dithyrambs, right? And as Nietzsche charts in that book, like the philological work that he does there is sound, even if he disagrees with his later spoiling of the work with Schopenhauerian formulations, and the fact that it smells offensively Hegelian, all of these problems. But the fact that he charts the development of tragedy from the dithyramb to the dithyrambic chorus to the early dramatic tragedies where it's literally Dionysus as the figure of the tragedy. In those early tragic depictions, Dionysus is sort of rent asunder, right? The famous incident with the Titans.
Yeah.
Dionysus as Zagreus. In that depiction, if we're to view that as an outpouring of the Dionysian, which Nietzsche talks about in the early passages of Birth of Tragedy as these cult, he says that there were Dionysian cults all throughout the ancient world. And he talks about the festival of Psyche at Babylon, that it's like this outpouring of ecstatic excess that overwhelms society. And that only by enclosing it within the sort of Apollonian magic circle were the Greeks able to deal with tragedy without having it overwhelm them. I guess my point would be, or my supposition would be that even in seeing the figure of Zagreus rent asunder, there is something thrilling about it or something ecstatic about it that constitutes that neurosis of the healthy or the luxury of the healthy. In the same way that, and maybe this is a trivial example, a really depressive film, if your life is going just fine, right, can be something that you can commune with or have that sort of pessimistic worldview transmitted to you in that way of them overflowing and sharing that feeling with you. And you can sort of absorb it and deal with it in a way that you might not be able to if that hits home too much. I mean, we might just say that on all these festivals, there's something about the self-forgetting, just explosive nature of these passions that are always tied to these sort of representations of Zagreus or tied to these rituals where all of society's order is reversed or torn down. I mean, we might think of Saturnalia, but apparently similar things happened at Psyche, where
It happened
slaves,
everywhere.
masters served their slaves and so on. That there's some sort of joy to the upheaval. There's some sort of joy to witnessing destruction. So maybe that's what, even in this passage, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to like synthesize our 2 points of view in a way. That I don't necessarily think the sharing of one's riches that he's talking about, I'm not necessarily trying to say that it's a catharsis. It could be that you're sharing the ecstasy of, Dionysian destruction or so on and so forth. And that might constitute why the Dionysian is such a dangerous force in the same way that philosophy is a dangerous force. Because one final point I would make that I was thinking of when you were talking about this is in the introduction or the introductory parts of Philosophy of the Tragic Age of the Greeks, where Nietzsche is sort of studying how is it that a culture develops philosophy? Why would they develop philosophy? And he makes a really peculiar claim that the philosopher can be a physician to culture, but only to that culture that is already healthy. In a healthy culture, the philosopher can enhance their health, but in a culture that's already sort of disintegrating, the philosopher will only hasten the disintegration.
Yeah, a culture in decline. Yeah.
And so it's almost like philosophy is another one of those luxuries.
Yes, it is. That's completely correct in my view. That's exactly how you should take it. Because we have to keep in mind that for Nietzsche, philosophy itself is basically art. And it's in the sense that it's also a luxury that is only afforded to a culture that can afford it. Like the reason itself is a luxury. It's something that is allowed once a culture is confident enough in itself. Is that clear? Or
Yeah. Right, because
it's very hard to talk about these things for the simple reason that we basically live in a post-Socratic world where reason is supposed to at least reign supreme, and where everything you say and everything you do and everything you argue, you have to give a foundation based on rationality and reason for it to be correct. But for these pre-Socratic, even pre-philosophy, to go back even further, but in these pre-Socratic, pre-reason cultures, so to speak, this was not a concern at all. You just had, like, he talks about this at length in the genealogy, but in these pre-moral, he calls them pre-moral societies, that there was never a question of we have to outsource our morality to some abstract thing like reason. And that's a totally alien mindset for us in the 21st century to wrap our heads around. So it's very difficult to talk about these subjects using
Well,
words, like word
right.
language as reason,
Well, because you think about the distinction between reason as a luxury and the way that we would view reason now, which is
as a necessity.
a necessity, right? We see reason as something beneath, like undergirding society. Like everything ought to be based on reason, is sort of how we think about it, versus the point of view that whatever else everything is based on, whether it's mystical revelation or divinely, handed down tradition or something of that nature, reason is like an excess, uh, something that is sort of on top. It's like the fruit of that culture.
Yes, exactly. And that's the main difference between us and the Greeks, according to Nietzsche at least. There is a passage. It is either in Twilight of the Idols or the Genealogy, but he says basically, he talks about Plato, and he says with Plato, reason becomes, he says it's basically an outgrowth of the agonal instinct in the Greeks. And the agonal instinct, that's agon is Greek for competition. So the Greeks were very fond of competition. First of all, in manners of athletics, of course, and they originated the Olympic Games. But with Plato and with philosophy in general and Socrates in general, the use of reason itself became like a competition. It became like that's what he says also about Plato. We can never forget that for Plato, philosophy is something that happens in the real world while yeah, well, while being in the real world. You know, he had his academy, the
Right.
conversations were happening. Plato writes in dialogues, which is not insignificant, you know, and he contrasts it with Spinoza as the archetypical philosopher, I guess, because when you read Spinoza, it's very Renaissance inspired. For very like Spinoza is almost mathematical. You know, he starts his big book Ethica with the substance is God or whatever, and it's very based on proposition one, proposition two. From these two, it follows, and it's very logical, very mathematical almost. And he says this couldn't be further from the contrast with Plato, where philosophy is a dialogue between two people, and almost in the manner of the sophists, is a contest of who can use words the best and who can use words in the most beneficial way. And for the sophists, what constitutes the beneficial is, of course, getting your own win in the argument. And for Socrates, what constitutes the best use of reason is, of course, getting to the truth, capital T, truth. But the
Right.
point is that philosophy and reason itself is an outgrowth of the Greek spirit for competition. But the word competition also implies that it's a game, if you know what I
Right.
mean. It's a luxury. You only play games, you only have playtime, leisure time when you're at a point where you can afford to play games and to have leisure time. In the same way that athletics and ancient Greek athletics in particular are basically simulations of war, you know? It's no
Right.
coincidence
Yeah.
that they throw spears and sprint and they do all these things that simulate warfare, which is like a real skin in the game type of thing. Whereas a athletic competition is just a game at the end of the day, you know. But still, these games were very important. And reason also, he says, Plato basically invented a new game for the Greeks, the game of reason, the game of using language to, yeah, defeat your opponents, basically. And that's also how he talks about Socrates, how Socrates used reason to talk to these Athenian celebrities, as he calls them, but basically the Athenian ruling class, and talks to them and says, hey, all these fancy ideals that you have about justice and beauty, how do you know that they are true? And then it always comes to pass that they have no basis at all. And Socrates plays a little of a he plays a game of chess with words basically, and he beats them in this game. And it's like this big revelation. Oh, these nobles, they don't know anything and they're just doing things. And the philosophical tradition, of course, takes the side of Socrates, but Nietzsche, in a very bold manner, takes the side of the nobles, who basically they don't have to care about Socrates. Like whether Socrates defeats them in an argument or not, no one really cares. You know, the nobles are just going to do what they're going to do, and Socrates can talk and discuss all he wants, and that's going to be it. You know.
Right. Well, it's almost, you could say that the fact that Socrates was, how does Nietzsche put it? He was a clown who made himself be taken
Yeah.
seriously.
He was a clown who succeeded in being taken seriously. How did he do it? Was he even a Greek? That's how he talks
Right.
about
And it's like evidence. There's that one passage, it's also in Twilight of Idols and The Four Great Errors, where he's saying, the political thinkers say, this party shall fail because it's made a mistake, but my higher politics says this party makes mistakes because it's already destined to fail. Or the church says vice and luxury destroys a society, but my higher perspective says a society that is already on its way to destruction will search for ever more powerful vices and luxuries. He talks about it physiologically, right? The more that you require stronger and stronger sensations for your nerves, the more that indicates a weakening of your nerves.
Yeah.
Uh, and so Socrates, I think one of Nietzsche's great insights is not only does he take the side of the nobles, he treats Socrates as the symptom of a problem. That the problem was precisely like perhaps there's always been men like Socrates, but the fact that Socrates comes along, well, maybe not. Nietzsche does say he's like got a monstrous inversion of his conscience and all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
But, maybe we might say that a figure like a Socrates comes along maybe a generation or every generation or so. But when the nobility just has an unquestioned belief in their own authority, that figure has no power, basically. It's the
Yeah,
fact that
he's
they
relegated.
stopped and let him interrogate them and
Exactly.
actually subjected themselves to reason, you know?
Yeah, that's what I should make clear, that Socrates didn't really do anything, in the sense that Socrates only succeeded because Greek society was ready to accept Socrates. And Nietzsche makes this very clear in a passage in Twilight of the Idols, where he says something like, the Greeks at this point, they all turned to play actors, so they were more than ready to submit to having morality preached to them. So they were already in a state of decline. They were already becoming less confident in being able to be the creators of their own values, and they were already looking for an excuse, basically, to outsource their morality to something else beyond themselves. So in this case, it would be reason.
What do you think about the connection or the parallel of Nietzsche himself filling the same role as Socrates?
Mhm.
Questioning, going and tapping his hammer against all the modern idols. Do Nietzsche's critiques of Socrates apply to himself?
That's a really good question. In many ways, yes. But Nietzsche is also very clear that he is all about, and this is actually the big divide, I guess, in contemporary Nietzsche scholarship, to use a big word, but Nietzsche interpretation. Nietzsche is very big on we have to not necessarily go back, because he says we have to surpass the Greeks, but he also says that we need to find the courage somehow, and he says the Übermensch will do this, but that's another can of worms. But we need to find the courage to become our own valuators again. So in that way, he goes very strictly against Socrates, because Socrates was all about adhering to some abstract principle, a principle called reason. So apparently, there is this objective way of doing things, this objective state of affairs that is not necessarily coming from ourselves, but exists somewhere else. And we call that thing reason. We think that reason exists somewhere independently from ourselves. And Plato made this most explicit when he launched the idea of the world of ideas. So out there, somewhere, there's the idea of justice with a capital J, the idea of beauty with a capital B. And Socrates leaned into that, or rather, Socrates originated that idea, the first seeds of that idea, when he talked about reason as this thing apart from human revelations. And he
Right.
pestered nobles, and Nietzsche also pesters the modern philosophers, by which he means basically everyone before him in the tradition of Plato. So in that way, he does fill like the Socratic role in I mean, Twilight of the Idols, the title itself already says that he's going to take to task all these philosophical idols, all these ideas. But his big point is basically that the whole Platonic idea even if we don't subscribe literally to the world of ideas, it still lives on in the way that we view things. We still believe that there is an objective justice somewhere, and philosophy is the way to approximate that perfect ideal of justice. Same with truth, same with beauty, but Nietzsche says it's with truth that things really become difficult. Because the truth, the idea that there is an objective truth out there somewhere, depends on an idea of God, and God is, of course, this outgrowth of Platonism. As he said, that Christianity is Platonism of the people. And so, in to come back to your question, yes, his criticisms of Socrates apply to himself, but he's also very different from Socrates in the way that he obviously wants the total opposite of what Socrates wanted, which is the outsourcing of our values and ideas to something outside of ourselves, which ultimately became God, while Nietzsche wanted for us to recognize again that values can come from ourselves. And the contemporary problem, and you see this with people like Jordan Peterson, for example, the contemporary problem comes from the question, is it even possible for humans to make valuations ourselves? Jordan Peterson says that's impossible, and that's how he got back to Christianity, which is like a weird thing for him to do, in my opinion, but whatever. But the point is, he doesn't believe that humans are capable of doing this. And Nietzsche himself is also very obviously between a rock and a hard place concerning this question. On the one hand, he's like, yeah, the Ubermensch will do it. But on the other hand, he's also, yeah, the Ubermensch, it's this future thing that will happen in the future. But
Yeah, something that came to mind when you were saying that and describing the Platonic theory of ideas or forms. Beauty, the idea of beauty with a capital B, uh, that is out there in the world somehow objectively. I wonder if that's the way in which figures like Schopenhauer and Kant were motivated by the Platonic view, if not of art, but of, beauty is obviously within the domain of aesthetics. And thinking about what Socrates says about beauty in the Symposium, in some way, the beautiful, the object of our desire or of our inner eros or whatever you might say, for Socrates is ultimately aimed at what you might call, I guess, a will to eternity or immortality. I mean, he cites Diotima, the uh, priestess of Eros, which I've always sort of read that passage as Socrates is making this up. This is,
I
this
think
is
it's
a.
true.
You
True,
think it's
actually.
true? It's fun to believe it's true.
This is very much covered in depth, by the way, and Foucault, so postmodern philosophy guy, in the history of sexual love. He has an entire book on it, and Diotima in the Symposium gets like an entire treatment of it. But go on, go on.
Does he think she was real, or does he
Yes,
argue?
yes,
Okay,
and I
okay.
think I think academic consensus is also that she was a real figure, and even if like the speech isn't a literal transcribation or whatever, at least it represented what she actually thought about things. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. There are so many times with Socrates where it just so happens that he finds a high priestess of Eros who seems to put forward ideas that are totally commensurate with Socratic philosophy, which seemed like a little too convenient for me whenever I've read the Symposium. But the line is that I've often drawn on that I think is most illustrative of the position is that she points out how an animal will fight to the death, the weaker against the stronger, to protect that which is its offspring, which you might say is a completely irrational way to behave, except that what we truly value is what we've given rise to beyond ourselves, because the way of the mortal is not to be absolutely the same forever like the divine is. Our way of having immortality is to give rise to that which is like us but not exactly the same as us. And it's a very interesting way of talking about the beautiful in a way that sort of unifies art, procreation, many of the things that kind of,
Mhm.
because art of the beautiful is related to love naturally.
This is really interesting, actually, because you make a clear link between the beautiful and eros, so the Greek word for sexual love, basically. There is a passage in Nietzsche that we talked about at the start of this conversation, where he accuses Schopenhauer. So as we talked about, Schopenhauer takes this whole Kantian framework, something that is pleasing without being interesting, that is the beautiful. He takes this whole Kantian framework, basically agrees with it, and adds to it this whole conception of the will and whatever interests us in a way that it allows us to escape from the will, you know? So it's not an interest in the world itself. It's like an interest in this abstract idea of the world, which is art. Whatever allows us that escape is what makes something beautiful or is what makes an aesthetic experience for us. And Nietzsche makes this big rhetorical show, as he is wont to do sometimes, where he'll say, "Oh, I'm afraid, Schopenhauer, that someone contradicts you, and it's no one else than the divine Plato, as you call him." And Plato famously said that all beauty inspires to procreation. So that all beauty is, as you said, inexorably linked to the human drive for procreation. And this is, he says, where Schopenhauer basically willfully ignores this blatant contradiction between his own theory of aesthetics and Plato's theory of aesthetics. Because for Schopenhauer, nothing could be worse than to give in to and to affirm the will. And the will is the will to life, the will to procreate, the will to have sex basically and get more children into the world. That's like the most evil thing that you can do according to Schopenhauer, because in his metaphysics the entire why is the world such a place of suffering? Well, because there is a fundamental divide between object and subject, which arises with thinking life. So as the will fundamentally is one, but we divide it into two as soon as we are born because we are a subject and we view the world as an object. And this is a divide, this is a dichotomy that breaks up what is essentially a unity, which is the will. So Schopenhauer says it would be better if nothing existed at all. That goes for objects, but that goes a fortiori for subjects, for things that, by virtue of being alive and being thinking conscious or conscious subjects, divide. They draw another line of division. Basically, they draw another line of we bring new subjects into the world, which brings in a way new objects into the world, which
Right.
makes more division into the fundamental unity of being. So Schopenhauer says procreation, creating new life, is basically the worst thing that you can do, which is why he says the complete chastity is the first virtue of the ascetic. You know, it's not just fasting, it's not just retreating to a mountaintop. The most important thing is to not have children, basically. And he goes completely against Plato with this, who linked the conception of beauty to Eros, to sexual love. And Nietzsche says there is this blatant contradiction here, and you seem to completely ignore it. And he, of course, plays with that in his characteristic way. But that's a very
Yeah.
interesting. Because the beauty, he goes on in this passage. He doesn't really give an argument, but we're used to that from Nietzsche. But he says, for example, people, aesthetics today, so in the 19th century, they put into the scales of Kant, so into the disinterested party, so to speak, they put into the scales of Kant the argument that even a sculpture of a beautiful naked woman can please the aesthetic sensibility without being arousing. And Nietzsche
Right.
basically, yeah, he basically says at this point, like, what a joke, you know, speak for yourself, you know. And he
Right.
brings up the point of Pygmalion, so the sculptor who fell in love with his sculpture, you know,
Yeah.
as a point of saying he was by no means an unesthetic person, this Pygmalion, you know?
So something interesting that I was thinking about, because there's a distinction that's made earlier in the Symposium between the Pandemian Eros and the Uranian Eros. And Socrates somewhat speaks to this in his penultimate speech in the Symposium, where the Eros is acknowledged as also the source of like literal procreation, but it seems as though Socrates is saying that the highest form is sort of like giving birth to wisdom or to virtue, basically, in so many words. If you can be the midwife of someone else's virtue by instructing
Mm.
them as to how to wisely behave, that's like that's the ultimate attainment of beauty in some way. And it made me think, as you were describing that Nietzschean attack on Schopenhauer, I think Schopenhauer wants that Uranian form of beauty that is completely rarefied and abstract. There's a passage. There's a passage in Daybreak where he says that Eros was made to drink poison
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
became the Christian version of love. Um,
yeah.
and we might think of the chaste knight who, like longs for and pines for his lady in a sort of in a platonic in a platonic sense. It seems to me that often what Nietzsche's critique takes the form of, especially in Beyond Good and Evil, but even going all the way back to Human All Too Human, is to show the ways in which our higher virtues, so to speak, are the roots of those are in passions, which we have tried to call vices. And it's exactly the same situation here with Schopenhauer, that he basically has at the root of what he sees as this highest form of aesthetic liberation from the will, at the root of that is something as base as sexuality. And
Mm.
philosophy has been this long exercise, mainly moralistic philosophy, and sort of cutting off the branches from the root, right? And placing all of those higher virtues as something descending from the lap of being, thing itself, or a Platonic idea, and trying to ignore or deny the base, vicious, immoral root of those things. And Eros, the Greek Eros, which Nietzsche says is not, it's one of the most tyrannical drives in a way, sexual
Hmm.
love. It's not the Christian view of love, of universal love, is almost like a contradiction of it, because it's attempted to deprive it of that tyrannical driving force. And so I think Nietzsche sees that in Schopenhauer, and there's that one passage, I don't know if it's the same one you're referencing, I'm trying to remember. He basically alleges that all of Schopenhauer's philosophy is based on sexual frustration. I mean, it like
Yeah,
anticipates Freud in many ways. That
he
Schopenhauer felt those urges so strongly, and so it's like a corresponding
yeah,
desire, ideal of repressing sexuality.
yeah, he has a funny sentence in that passage where he says that you must never forget that Schopenhauer was 26 years old when he wrote The World as Will and Representation. So that it's a work of a youth, a young man who's in the full blossom of his sexual urges, so to speak, which is very, very interesting to me because the whole work is an argument against sexuality, you know? So
Yes.
you can get very Freudian with that and think of what it means and psychoanalyze Schopenhauer, which Nietzsche did to excess, I would say. But that's a very interesting point right there. Yeah, very true.
Yeah, I think of also there's a passage in Schopenhauer where he says, God, I really want to use the internet slang for this.
Go on.
But post nut clarity is what
Yeah, the devil's laughter.
Schopenhauer, the devil's laughter, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like he thinks that the sexual impulse, like I can kind of understand it, honestly, because I experimented with Buddhism. I'll put it like that.
Mhm.
And once you get into your own head about thinking about your own desires, you can definitely see your own desires as like this demonic thing. Against my own
Mm.
will, this passion or drive is like welling up in me and trying to force me to do things that are against my own interest. And it could be anything. It could be like during that time I was vegetarian when I was practicing Buddhism. I have this new moral idea that eating meat is bad. It's an undue consumption of resources on this planet, right?
Mhm, mhm,
And I have to do my best to live as close. Obviously, I'm not a monastic, but I'm going to live. That's my ideal, right? But
mhm.
then that creates, when you have that same feeling that the we described earlier, we're like, man, I really could just use a Big Mac right now. That feels like something. I mean, demonic is really the only way I can describe it. I mean, it also has to do with Schopenhauer's view on women and the whole feminine sex as sort of like these sirens, like pulling us into samsara.
The instrumentum diaboli, the instrument of the devil. That's what
Yeah,
Nietzsche says calls Schopenhauer women, you know?
right. And so it's like to me, that has to, I mean, it ties in with Nietzsche's view of idealizing, that in any person's ideal, we can see their great lack or what they wish they could attain to. And so, from that perspective, it would seem that Schopenhauer was indeed in the storm of desire. And his philosophy has to become this iron repudiation of desire in order to be strong enough to actually suppress it. Because from all accounts, Schopenhauer doesn't live like a libertine. You know, he succeeds in
Hmm.
repressing it.
I'm not sure. Well, he obviously didn't live like a libertine, but he also didn't live like a monk. You know,
Sure.
like by all accounts, he lived like the upper class gentleman type of life available to him in 19th century Europe. You know, going to the theater every day, being independently wealthy because of his father's inheritance. He didn't live. He preached. I mean, preach is a wrong word because he didn't preach. He always maintained that his ethics was descriptive, not prescriptive. So whatever. But it's obvious that for Schopenhauer, the ascetic ideal, the life of the monk, is like the ethical ideal as well. And
Hmm.
obviously, he fell very, very short of that. He spent his money quite liberally, even though he doubled it, while his mother and sister actually completely squandered the inheritance of his father. But that's another point. But the point is, he lived like a life of leisure. He lived a life full of sensual pleasures. He also had quite a lot of sex, by the way, which is something that, which is a misconception that I want to rid the world of. That Schopenhauer was this frustrated incel. You know,
Mm.
he had affairs with women. He even had a few illegitimate children, and at least one of them died in infancy. So yeah, that's what happened in those times. You know,
So he joins the Rousseau
children.
Club.
Sorry.
Joins the Rousseau Club of having kids and letting them die.
I mean, letting them die. I think he had tuberculosis or something, and
Oh, okay, okay, okay,
yeah,
okay.
it was not like he
I thought
didn't.
you were saying it was the child of an affair, and he kind of
Yeah,
just
it was a child of an affair, but
okay.
it's not very clear in which way or how much he actually neglected the child. You know,
Mm.
there is one big famous anecdote. So there's this little girl, I should not say, but a 19-year-old woman. But Schopenhauer was in his 60s, you know, so that feeds into the mystique or like the misconception, you know, that Schopenhauer was preying on these young women. But there is this one woman that he met on a boating party in Berlin, and he gave her like a flower or something. So you have to keep in mind Schopenhauer is 60 years old. This woman was 19 years old, so barely an adult, you know. And he gives her this rose or this flower, and she discreetly throws it overboard, you know. And later on in her diary, she writes, "Oh, old man Schopenhauer tried to seduce me, gave me a flower, and I was very disgusted." Okay, so we have this anecdote from his life. But this anecdote where he got rejected by a woman who was like 40 years younger than him, this became this huge, famous anecdote. And people think that because he got rejected once, that must mean he was like this unappetizing figure, I guess, like this repulsive person to women in general, which is like historically not true at all. We know that he went on a pleasure trip through Europe with one of his best friends, a French guy called Antime. And that's also quite interesting because Antime was like a handsome young man. Schopenhauer was less handsome. And he notes in his diary that he's quite jealous actually of the success with the ladies that his friend has. And he feels like he should deserve more success with the opposite gender. But, you know, because Antime, his best friend, is much more handsome, he gets more success. And that all feeds into this narrative of Schopenhauer as the guy who got rejected by women all the time and who was ugly, and that's why he wrote his whole essay against women, basically, you know.
Right.
But historically, that's just not true. We know that he had affairs with multiple women, that he was, by all accounts, like it depends on what you define as successful. Obviously, he never married. He considered marriage a form of slavery, really. So he never
Right.
married, but he did have affairs. He did also take care of the women that he dated with financially, you know. So I just wanted to get that little
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
out of the discourse, you know, that Schopenhauer was this hopeless incel and he hated women, and that's why he wrote this very invective. It's true. It's a very misogynistic, invective text, but it's not because he was unsuccessful with women, you know.
Right. I have a much harder argument if I'm to defend Nietzsche on that point, so I won't. But I will say I didn't know most of that. But I guess maybe my mental framework for thinking of Schopenhauer if not approximating the aesthetic lifestyle, it's mainly his daily habits and the fact that he seemed like he lived a very predictable life. That he spent his hours every day doing the same things, and that routine and that structure. It's not monastic, like as you say. He has his leisure time, and he's got his like time for his youthful, love affairs, and even into old age, I guess. It's not as if his life was, super chaotic or like,
Oh no, no, no.
adventures or anything like that. It seems like he really liked the regularity. He liked the structure.
Yes, and he had very good reasons for that, but they don't necessarily fit in with his philosophy. So there's an interesting. He wrote a book, the book that brought him fame, because as viewers might know, that his initial philosophy was very much ignored. He only became famous through his later essays that were written for the general public, not necessarily for like philosophical academia. But he wrote a book on the wisdom, aphorisms on the wisdom of life. That's what it's called in English, where he basically writes a guide to the happy life. So how to reach eudaimonia in Aristotle's terms, how to reach the happy life. But in the preface to that, he's very clear. He says, what I am now going to relate goes completely counter to the conclusion that I reach at the end of my philosophy, which is basically that life is not worth living and you should distance yourself and you should negate the will as much as
Yeah,
possible.
there is no happy life in
Yeah, so
Bulger's world representation.
he says basically like assume for a moment that life is worth living. Here's how you do it. But that's a very big if. At the end of that, he says the best you can hope for, even if you assume life is worth living, even if, which is a big if already, but even if life is worth living, the best you can hope for is this very gentle, uneventful life. And he makes the analogy with a very peaceful little river of water, not a big storm, not a big tsunami, not a tempest. No, just a nice, gentle, peaceful stream of water where day after day things just flow into one big whole. And a big part of that is his routine. And that's, of course, the complete opposite of what you could call a Nietzschean type of life. But the irony of history is that Nietzsche lived a much more ascetic lifestyle than Schopenhauer ever did.
Just by virtue of the solitude of it and seclusion, if nothing else.
Nietzsche lived in the mountains. Yeah, he lived in the Alps for a long time, where he famously wrote Zarathustra. But he also lived in the coastlines of Italy, where he went on these marathon type walks. Like at
Yeah.
one point, he talks about walking from Portofino to somewhere else, and I looked it up on Google Maps, and it was like this 8-hour hike every single day, which is insane. But the thing about Nietzsche is he's such an interesting character. He was obviously overflowing with some type of vitality, while at the same time, physiologically, his body just worked against him every step of the way. With his terrible migraines, eventually his opium addiction, the migraines that are so horrible that at some points he went blind. But then you have these periods of extreme productivity where he goes on 8-hour hikes. He writes Twilight of the Idols in 4 days' time. These extreme
Yeah.
periods of productivity coupled with this like monkish lifestyle of basically being tortured by his own body, while at the same time having this zest for life.
Yeah,
Very
it's
strange,
the
very interesting.
beginning of Ecce Homo, where he says that he has both ascent and descent in him. He has both health and degeneration as part of his
Yeah.
heritage. His father who dies of liquefaction of the brain when Nietzsche's 5, and then his mother, uh, as his mother is the source of his health and vitality, according to Nietzsche. He did also live a very predictable lifestyle. I've started to wonder if that is just a trait of German philosophers, because Kant also famously, you could set your watch by when he goes on his walks, and Nietzsche's daily habits are very similar to Schopenhauer's in some ways, even though they advocate for completely different views of what the good life would look like. Right?
Yeah.
They performatively live the same way. I did want to ask you, maybe to like as a final topic, because we haven't talked about Wagner yet, but I remember there's a passage where Nietzsche, we I guess we brought up Wagner a bit at the beginning, as its centrality to birth of tragedy. But there's a passage, I believe it's in the Gay Science, where Nietzsche is saying that Wagner, he was a man with a great artistic task, and then at some point on his voyage, he shipwrecks on the reef of Schopenhauerian philosophy.
Yeah.
And for one, I always thought it was a bit of a strange way for Nietzsche to characterize Wagner's failure, so to speak, because as well as with that passage that you mentioned earlier, what is romanticism? Because in many ways, Nietzsche is criticizing Wagner for falling for the trap of Schopenhauer's thinking when that seems to have been the very thing on which they bonded when they first met, Nietzsche and Wagner, was
Yeah.
they were discussing their mutual love of Schopenhauer. And so when Nietzsche then criticizes Wagner for that, it's funny because it's like, well, what, you mean the very thing that you liked about his music when you first heard it is its main problem. But I was wondering what you thought of Nietzsche's allegation there. Do you see Schopenhauerian themes as central to Wagner's music?
That's a very big question
Yeah.
because
Sorry.
it's interesting on multiple levels, actually. That's why I hesitated for a bit. Because, so the traditional view, so we know from historical record that Wagner discovers Schopenhauer through the recommendation of a friend somewhere three-fourths into composing the Ring cycle. So the thing is, Wagner he wrote the libretto first, and he composed the music later. So he had already written the text of the entire Ring cycle, and he was three-fourths of the way through composing it, so setting it to music, when he discovered Schopenhauer. So the Ring is composed of Das Rheingold, Die Walküre, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. And Götterdämmerung, that's where he discovered Schopenhauer. And already in the Ring, it's two worlds opposed to each other in a way. So the Ring is all about humans overthrowing the gods. It's based on Germanic myth. It's based on a warrior ethos. It steps on all kinds of toes of polite society at the time. The character of Siegfried, for example, is born of the incestuous relationship of a brother and sister, which was, by the way, very anathema to Schopenhauer. So Wagner mailed Schopenhauer the libretto for the Ring. Schopenhauer never replied, but we do have his little comments in the sidelines of the libretto, where he's very, very dismissive of Siegfried's origins and the celebration of incest, basically. But that's all Wagner when he's pre-Schopenhauer. That's Wagner as the anarchist, as the socialist revolutionary who participated in all these revolutions in Europe in 1848. He participated in the Revolution of Dresden in 1848, which is why he was banished from Germany for a
Right, for
while.
like
And
10 years or something, 20 years?
yeah,
Long
and then
time,
he
right?
he he fled to Switzerland, and that's where he was introduced to Schopenhauer. And so in Götterdämmerung, in Twilight of the Gods, you already have this Schopenhauerian. He changed the ending also a little bit. You have the Schopenhauerian influence, but where the Schopenhauerian influence really happens is in the operas Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, and of course Parsifal.
Yeah.
And that's where the Schopenhauerian virus, as Nietzsche would say, took ultimate root, you know? But the interesting thing is that all these ideas of Schopenhauer's, you could argue, are already in embryonic form, were already there in Wagner's operas. So, for example, the redemptive power of love, or the primacy of music. And he has this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, where every little piece of the aesthetic experience, so the music, the performance, the text, the libretto, all plays an equally important part. And Wagner became very famous for popularizing the Gesamtkunstwerk. But the interesting thing is that he stepped away from that idea as soon as he knew Schopenhauer, who said that music is the number one art. And you can see it in Götterdämmerung. The Ring is very adherent to his ideas of the Gesamtkunstwerk, where everything that happens in the opera, you can tell that Wagner really tried to fit everything into its proper place. Every piece of music is fitted with a line of text. In Götterdämmerung, that's already mostly gone, you know?
Mm.
So the question was, I'll get back to, to the original question. So the Schopenhauerian influence in Wagner is a very complicated question because on the surface, the Schopenhauerian influence could only happen in the final three operas and a little bit of Götterdämmerung, because that's when he knew Schopenhauer. That he wrote Tristan und Isolde, after a summer where he read Schopenhauer 4 times in one summer, and in a flurry of inspiration, as he says it himself, he composed Tristan und Isolde. But the reason why, that's like level 2 of the question. The reason why he resonated with Schopenhauer so much is because many of Schopenhauer's ideas were already present in embryonic form in his earlier operas. Because you might as well say, like, why should he care about Schopenhauer? Well, the reason he cared is that he recognized much of his own intuitions about what it means to be redeemed from the suffering of the world, etc. He found all those ideas in agreement with Schopenhauer, and then he clinged to Schopenhauer as his master, basically, as his philosophical inspiration. And that's the point where Nietzsche says, now you've lost the plot. In the ring cycle, you have this warrior ethos, you have this exuberance, you have the celebration of life, the celebration of sexuality, very important. You have the celebration of humans overthrowing the gods, literally creating their own new world from scratch, away from the influence of God. And then you throw that all away, and with Parsifal and with Tristan und Isolde, you embrace chastity, you embrace Christian iconography, you embrace basically everything that you rejected with your earlier work. And that's where Nietzsche says you misunderstood Romanticism.
Right. I think what's fascinating to me is maybe more so has to do with Nietzsche, because isn't it Tristan and Isolde that Nietzsche says that's the first thing he hears from Wagner, isn't it?
Yes.
And that it just absolutely enchants him, and that is a work that is written in Schopenhauer's thrall.
It is Schopenhauer put to music, yeah.
Right. And furthermore, it's like the Meistersinger, which was what that's how Wagner learns of Nietzsche, is that he's heard Nietzsche, as he hears from Friedrich Ritschl's wife that she's heard Nietzsche play it, and that's when he wants to, go meet with him. Maybe the question that I have is, and I don't know if there's really a good answer to this, because in spite of everything that Nietzsche wrote about Wagner and about Schopenhauer, I don't know if he really comprehended that this was a problem. But I wonder, it's like what Nietzsche would say, why did you resonate so deeply with Wagner's most Schopenhauerian works, only to later turn around and be like, that's the precise moment where he lost the plot, where he like shipwrecked his philosophy. And then with like a retrospective look to say, yeah, you had it before. Basically, before Nietzsche ever met Wagner is when he would say in his later years, that's when Wagner like got it, so to speak. That's where he's presenting this vision of, like, as you say, overthrowing the gods and creating our own values anew. It's a mystery to me, or it's like one of those really esoteric questions about Nietzsche and his relationship to Wagner that I've always had in the back of my mind, that I don't know if there is a good answer for, of how did Nietzsche understand his own bewitchment with Schopenhauerian art. And I guess he kind of, he answers it somewhat in saying that he didn't, I think it's in that passage, What is Romanticism, that he didn't comprehend what Romanticism really was, right? That I believe that's the passage where he's saying that pessimism could be an active pessimism or something of that nature.
Yes,
that's leading you to destroy and lay barren the field so that new things can take root, or it could just be resignationism. And that's what he finally recognized, that Schopenhauer was just a romantic in that sense of looking backward to being pessimistic towards the future. There's nothing that we can accomplish, so on and so forth. My only problem with that explanation of Nietzsche's, though, is I have a hard time believing that he didn't understand that that's what Schopenhauerian philosophy was resignationism at the moment when he's listening to Tristan and Isolde. Because I think Nietzsche agreed with that. I think if he was truly a young Schopenhauerian, he must have agreed. Like, the way that he answers David Strauss in the Untimely Meditations, where he talks about, no, the sum total of all the untold suffering in the world is beyond our comprehension, right? It's one of the issues he takes with him, is that, life can be good in this new secular world. Nietzsche was saying no. He's throwing in his lot sort of with the pessimistic atheism of Schopenhauer. And so I just wonder if maybe Nietzsche, in this one issue, is not as self-aware as he normally is. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, but I think what your maybe the first step towards an answer here is that all these things that you've just quoted, these are old writings of Nietzsche. And at some point, he recognized that There's a passage in Twilight of the Idols. I forget which. I think it's even the problem of Socrates in Skirmishes of an Untimely Man or Skirmishes in a War with the Age. But he says, at some point, he writes, I realized that every philosopher answers the question, is life good or bad, with the answer, bad.
Right. And he says that this question, whether one says yes or no to life, is not something that can be logically derived.
Exactly. And it's an indication of someone's psychological and physiological constitution. He says there is a consensus sapientium. So I don't know why he uses Latin, but it means like a consensus of the wise. So every philosopher agrees, fundamentally life is not worth living or is like a bad thing as opposed to all the good things that life has to offer. And he says like the to answer to the question of life, to answer with no says more something about the person who says no than about life itself. Because Nietzsche argues that you can't, as a human, you are not in a position to objectively judge life because a living man, he says, is a contending party. There's this
Right. And the dead
expression,
can't
I
judge
guess.
it for other reasons.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a very nice quip of him, very Schopenhauerian, actually, very dry humor.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he says like the living are an interested party, so they can be objective in their evaluation of life, and a dead person can't judge life because, well, yeah, for other reasons.
Yeah.
That's the big click that he makes, I think, in his psyche, where he recognizes that the problem of life, question, is life worth living, yes or no, is not a logical philosophical question, but it's a psychological physiological question, and the healthy will answer in the affirmative, and the unhealthy, which tend to be most philosophers, will say no to that question.
Right.
And I
It
think that's where he makes
indicates a sickness of philosophy, or that philosophy has been characterized by sickness. Like,
yes, exactly, from its inception, yeah. Because it goes back to what we talked about with regards to reason. Like the Athenian nobles, they just lived their lives. They didn't think about, am I doing the good thing? They didn't even have a conception of a good existing independently of themselves. No, whatever I do is good. If I conquer, like going back to the pre-moral age of mankind, as Nietzsche calls it, if I do something, if I conquer territory, if I subjugate this people, then it's good for the mere reason that I do it, not because I appeal to some kind of abstract principle of what is just, what is right, what is good. And that's the pre-moral stage. As soon as we get into philosophy and we outsource our morality to something abstract like reason, well, that's basically the definition of philosophy, trying to be reasonable, trying to find the independent good. But that's also a sign of sickness. And I think when Nietzsche recognizes that it is a sickness and it's not just a healthy, rational way of looking at the world, that's where he finds his first real break with Schopenhauer. Because Schopenhauer is just, especially in Nietzsche's conception, Schopenhauer is just the continuation of a pattern that started with Plato, that started even with Socrates, that life is not worth living. Like the ancient quip goes, that philosophy is about learning how to die, basically. And Nietzsche
right.
says, if that's your starting position, then you must be sick. What is a healthy way of looking at life? Nietzsche says, that would be an affirmation of life, and then you get into Nietzsche, basically.
Well, and that's the value of Schopenhauer, is that in, like, as you say, he conceives of his ethics as descriptive and something that he derives from reason and from the tradition of like the greatest philosophers, and stripped away from all of the particular religious imagery or symbolism, or any of the long arguments throughout the history of philosophy, is just with crystal clarity the statement life is not worth living, right? The ethics
Hmm.
of negating the will. And the perception of that is incredibly valuable. There's the line where Nietzsche says, "What a joy it is to have one's antipodes." And I was thinking about it when you were saying it. The good of the Athenians was embodied in them, and
Yes.
the good of Plato is disembodied. And this idea of the disembodied versus the disembodied is always that symbol of sickness. And then we could even apply it to the view of art, right? That if the Eros drive, when it's embodied, that's an affirmation of life, and that manifests in it, if not just in the form of the sexual impulse, in the art of, say, a Pygmalion, right? Where
Hmm.
you recognize the embodied roots of your aesthetic artistic creation, the passionate roots of it, of saying, this is an expression of my Eros, right? Versus the disembodied view of artistic creation, which who gives that to us? It's the philosophers, right? The sick
Mhm.
philosophers
Big
who
ones,
then
yeah.
have a sick view of art, which is a disembodied view of art, where
Yeah, they're
art
all
is
about the philosopher is all about taking things away from the body.
right, which it's like the I think Epictetus is like a really interesting figure to study for this, the late Stoic, and the way that he sort of establishes the Stoics as seeing the individual as soul first and seeing all of the passions as your enemy. That's what renders us incapable of listening to reason. And he also makes a number of remarks about death and mortality. What is it? You are a little soul carrying a corpse, as I believe the way
Yeah.
Epictetus
But
puts
that's,
it.
technically, that's also the Christian way to look at things, you know?
Yeah, yeah, it is. But I think that puts it really clearly, right? The
Hmm.
disembodied worldview, you might
Yeah.
say. And there is like a really subtle way in which that ties into the way Nietzsche sees the whole problem of science. Maybe even why, referencing earlier, somebody like Spinoza coming after the Middle Ages and at the beginning of the Renaissance writes the way that he does. Why philosophy becomes so objective. I think, in a way, the whole viewing of the world as just a bunch of objects is sort of like a natural, that's often presented today. Again, to bring up somebody like Jordan Peterson, he would say, "Oh, you view the world as a series of material objects because of the world's been demystified in a way, right?" But I
Yeah.
would actually say the very fact that you have this Platonic ideas or the whole world of the spirit, or you are a mind driving a body, you're a spirit carrying a corpse. It kind of inclines you to view this world just in terms of objects and in terms of mechanism, if that makes sense. Like it
Yeah, but what you said like brought to mind something. It's maybe quite paradoxical, but it made me think because you say you view the world as a collection of objects, but for Nietzsche, interestingly, that's also a gateway to nihilism, basically.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that's one of the ways in which the modern sort of mechanistic worldview, the numerous remarks about how he says that science is a new form of asceticism.
Yeah, and that's so underexplored. I try to bring attention to that in my videos, but I feel like that's a very important aspect of Nietzsche because you can talk about his views on Christianity all day, every day, but at the end of the day, like Christians are going to be Christians, you know. But his views on science, that's something that everyone is kind of unaware of, while at the same time, everyone is a staunch believer in science. And you see where I'm getting at here? Like
Yeah,
you're the strict Christians are either going to ignore Nietzsche or disavow him on the basis of, oh, he was a weakling and blah blah blah. But most people nowadays, especially in secular Europe and America, they are scientists in a way. You know, they affirm all these scientific discoveries, and Nietzsche was really one of the first to say, yeah, but there's also a psychological mechanism going on behind the scenes with all these scientists, you know.
yeah. Not only yes, that their will to truth is not just a dispassionate search to understand the objective world. There's some other motivation behind it. But
Hmm.
also the fact, and I don't think this really clicked with me until I read Deleuze. The asceticism of science is kind of like the way that Nietzsche talks about the camel, is that you sort of see reality as like something that you carry off on your back, that you just accept what is given by the so-called empirical facts, and you take that on diligently. You don't do it, you don't have any choice in the matter. It's your duty, it's your obligation, it's your sort of vow, so to speak, to take only what is empirically given as the truth. And yes, that ignores the psychological, it ignores perspective in some way. But there is
Hmm.
something that I think that people, maybe the aesthetic aspect is that they get a kind of pleasure out of conceiving of their worldview that way, as like this objective construction of a mind independent reality. And I mean, you see it. I mean, the most vulgar forms are the people who are like the "I fucking love science" type crowd,
Hmm.
which I'm sure we're all familiar with. But I think Nietzsche's right that it's the least disinterested thing in the world. Just like with his criticism of Schopenhauer, that art is not disinterested or
Hmm.
dispassionate. There's something about the power that one feels of I have this objective, mind independent view of reality in my mind. you know,
Yeah, I would add to that that the pleasure, as Nietzsche puts it, the self-hatred, as Nietzsche says, is also a kind of pleasure. And very often it's the only type of pleasure afforded to the weak, as he puts it. And he says
right?
that's the impulse, the impetus to the Christian self-flagellation doctrines and stuff. Like when you so self-flagellation is literally hitting yourself with a whip, for example, literally inflicting pain of yourself on yourself. So on the surface, it's obviously the least pleasurable thing in existence. But Nietzsche says there is also a particular pleasure into inflicting pain on yourself, because at any rate, you are allowed to feel something, which is better than nothing. So pain is better than nothing.
Right. And then
And
you can
everyone,
feel, oh, sorry, just quickly. Then you also get to be the punisher as well as the punished.
yeah, and it's better to be something like that, to be in the strange paradoxical thing of being the punished punisher, basically. It's better than being nothing at all, which is the entire point of the genealogy, which is people view it as a history book, but it's actually a masterpiece in psychology. The entire main argument of the genealogy is that man would rather will nothing than not will at all, which is a very deep statement, and he takes the entire latter third of the book to expound upon that. But the point is that we would rather feel something, even if that something is nothing, than that we would feel nothing, which is a very mysterious phrase, and he knows it's mysterious, and that's why he teases you all throughout this third essay of the genealogy, like, what is the meaning of ascetic ideals? And he keeps teasing you, and like a symphony, he builds up to the ultimate answer, and the very last sentence is that mankind would sooner will nothing than not will at all. But the thing is, we would rather will destruction, we would rather will pain, we would rather will a return to nothing than just not will in the first place, which is what Schopenhauer was all about. So when Nietzsche said the Christian enjoys inflicting pain on himself, whether it is through literal self flagellation, or whether it's more of a psychological pain where you deny yourself physical pleasure, such as sex or lots of food or whatever, you deny yourself pleasure, it is a feeling of power. And in the case of the Christian, in the historical context of them being oppressed by the Roman Empire, it's the only quantum of power, as Nietzsche says, that is afforded to them. So there is a pleasure in depriving yourself of pleasure and
Right.
depriving yourself of your own importance. And that there is this little, not just a physical self flagellation, but also psychological. And it's very clear in Christian terms, where Christians say during Catholic Mass, for example, Lord, I am not worthy that you come to me, but speak and I shall blah, blah, blah. But the little phrase, I am not worthy, which is like a form of psychological self torture, you're literally kneeling, you're literally saying, I'm worthless, basically. Nietzsche says we get a particular kind of pleasure from that. But the interesting point is because everything that I have said up until now, most people will kind of, if you're not a hardcore Christian at least, you will kind of agree with that there is this element of self debasement, in the Christian sphere. But it becomes interesting when Nietzsche talks about science and he says the same psychological phenomenon of pleasure in your own worthlessness also exists in the scientific drive. And for me, that really clicked when the James Webb telescope released new images of galaxies, and
Hmm.
like this most high definition new picture of the countless galaxies in the universe, and blah blah blah. And people on social media, like the red thread that runs throughout all those reactions was, oh wow, we are so insignificant in the big universe, we're just
Yeah.
monkeys on a rock floating through space, like the cliche goes. And
You know,
that's what Nietzsche talks about when he says the pleasure of debasing yourself.
it goes back to the pale blue dot, uh,
Yeah, yeah,
from
that's
Carl
like the
Sagan, and
testament of the scientific mindset. Yeah,
it's a wonderful example because he's like the archetypal scientist or science communicator. And what does he communicate in that message, which people regard as like a beautiful message? But he's basically saying everything mankind has ever struggled for or done has been worthless, even
yeah,
in
it's yeah.
comparison to what we know to be the vastness of the universe.
I mean, I've listened to that. I made a video on it as well. I've listened to that speech countless times, and I remember being 15 years old, and I was also. It's a that's by the way the same critique that Nietzsche had of Wagner. It's a very seductive message. It's a very the speech is good, and you really there is on one level, there is very much truth to it. Like, obviously, Nietzsche doesn't say that these scientific discoveries are wrong per se, you know? Obviously, that there are these big other galaxies. Obviously, the universe is really big, and obviously, we are just one planet out of billions and billions of planets. But from that information, it does not follow that our lives are meaningless, as if the scale of the universe says something about the meaning of your life, you know? And I think
Yeah.
that's where lots of people they take the scale of the universe and they assume it's a category error, you know? Just because something is big and you are small doesn't mean that you're insignificant. What is small can be very significant.
Right. Yeah. I think maybe they could benefit from reading the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
That'll be my prescription at the end. Well, I guess as a final question, how do you personally see art? I mean, do you take from both the Nietzschean and the Schopenhauerian view? Do you lean towards one or the other? Do you have your own view that's sort of outside of any of that, or just how do you conceive of it, or in the modern world and in your engagement with it?
That's an interesting question. So my two favorite operas are Tristan und Isolde and Parsifal. And Nietzsche is very famous for decrying Parsifal as being. He says, like, everyone
Yeah,
who does not see Parsifal as an attack on basic ethics, I regard as an enemy or something like that. So I guess I would be Nietzsche's enemy. But there's
yeah,
a big rabbit hole to go into there because Nietzsche wrote or read the libretto of Parsifal. He didn't hear the music until later. And all his denouncements of Parsifal in public books are based on the libretto, not on the music. As soon as he heard the music, he wrote to his sister, like, "Has Wagner ever done better?" And all other music compared to this sounds like a mistake to me. And he's very jubilant about the music itself. He
right.
just disagreed with the libretto. For me personally, I try to. There is an element where I tend to agree with Schopenhauer more than with Nietzsche. Where in good art, whenever I think what are my most memorable aesthetic experiences, I have to agree with Schopenhauer that those are the moments where I completely forgot myself. And I think that's a very intuitive way of enjoying art. And an artwork is better the more it allows you to forget yourself when you're immersed in modern terms, you know?
Yeah,
So when you can completely just absorb the music and completely forget that you are a living, breathing human being. And Schopenhauer has a beautiful term for that. He calls it a disembodied angel's head or like angel's wings. You know, where he says like just the spirit is what counts. You know, just the geist is what counts.
yeah,
When you can forget for a moment that you are a living, breathing human being with all your human struggles and all your human troubles, and you can just lose yourself in the music to
yeah,
use an Eminem lyric. But I think that's the. I find it very hard to disagree with that as much as I like Nietzsche and as much as I want to like him on that point. I think Schopenhauer ultimately was correct because I can't argue with how I feel when I listen to Tristan und Isolde. And it's so masterful and it's so perfect in every way. And to know that it is completely born out of Schopenhauer's philosophy just makes me more drawn towards Schopenhauer,
yeah.
you know?
I would say maybe as just my final remark, as a musician myself, I definitely feel what you're talking about, but from the other side of it, I also do feel there is something to that Nietzschean view of excess or ecstasy where a lot of my songs are me trying to express something that I can't necessarily say discursively that is a feeling and that I like want other people to feel. Right? I want, as Nietzsche says, to do violence to them and force them to share in my luxury. That I
Mhm.
have some sort of, there are certain feelings that are really sort of part of my artistic palette. So one of them would be sort of like a beautiful melancholy, I might say. Maybe the best way I could describe it is the Japanese have a term called mono no aware, which is basically beauty because something is fragile, like the beauty of falling leaves, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
the very fact that they're fragile is part of, and that everything is fleeting is what makes it beautiful. And so, like, is that an emotion per se? I feel I felt that as an emotion. I've tried to like convey that through pure music in a way. The lyrics are a part of it too. But I would agree with Schopenhauer and wholeheartedly that music has this non-representational um, sort of expression of the will has a special place. But I've definitely felt that what I'm trying to do musically is to impart a feeling as well. And so I don't know, maybe that can involve maybe both in the ideal, artistic communion where the artist and the audience are on the same wavelength. Maybe that also constitutes a losing of yourself, right? Because you're in some sense entering into this feeling that is not yours, right? I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if it's actually true psychologically, but that's how I felt about creating art over the years. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
it's very interesting to me how, harkening back to the start of our conversation, that I talk about art, and I obviously talk about art as being a spectator and being a listener, and I identify with Schopenhauer, and you talk about art as an artist, someone who creates, and you are more drawn to Nietzsche on that point. So it's basically just the same as the start of our conversation, where Nietzsche's critique rather of Schopenhauer is that he's stuck in the paradigm of his theory of beauty and aesthetics is based on the POV of the spectator, and Nietzsche tries to incorporate the POV of the creator, of the artist himself. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's like an interesting parallel, and because I can't read music, I can't play music, I can just enjoy it. So I'm not in a position to talk about like the mindset of the artist, so to speak. I can only speak from the perspective of someone who really enjoys art, much like Schopenhauer.
Yeah. Yeah, our conversation, just as all things eternally will, returned to the beginning. A wonderful circle. Well, I think this is great. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure having you on. And do you have anything that you want to plug? Any new projects you're working on, or anything you want to shout out at the end of the show here?
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've greatly enjoyed this conversation. People who are not familiar with my work, you can just YouTube the channel Weltgeist, Weltgeist. I focus on Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. I've been working on a long analysis video of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which has been highly requested and will come out in due time, but I just want to do it justice because it's probably Nietzsche's most important book. So I don't want to release something of subpar quality. But if you're looking forward to that, you can just go to my channel and hit the subscribe button.
I do not envy you in that task.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, I feel like whatever I do, it's not going to do it justice.
yeah. So I wish you the best of luck on your undoubtedly tragic attempt. No, no, you're.
Thank you. That's very uplifting.
I'll definitely check it out. All right. Thank you, Weltgeist.
Thank you very much. Until next time.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.